off. Mary's been in touch with Linda. Linda's doing well, from what I understand. I have not been able to reach her, but I did talk to Pam Dahlstrom, and Pam completed her chemotherapy, and there's nothing more that they can do. So keep her in prayer as well. This morning, Alan read from the Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting is, and I miss Mary for this because we talk about this during the week, Matthew records his gospel in a way that, as I'm reviewing it now, is so revolutionary. The title, Satisfaction Guaranteed, and I apologize this morning for my voice. I'm going to go through a lot of changes week to week. Now I'm really dry, so I appreciate you guys bearing with me. I'll try not to choke up here and scare you to death. I'm getting better with that. But when Jesus says in Matthew 5, which is right after Matthew records right after Jesus' baptism, and then he goes immediately and is taken away, and he's tempted in the temptation, 40 days and 40 nights. And then he launches into, Matthew begins Jesus' ministry with the Sermon on the Mount. And I would imagine, if you look at the life of Matthew, Levi, a tax collector, I was reading, I actually do read this, Claudia, I was reading the bulletin, and the front of this about humility and about the confrontation of the rulers, the apparent rulers in Jerusalem at the time, the Jewish rulers at the time Jesus comes on the scene. Imagine this was very revolutionary. They were expecting a Messiah who was going to come and reestablish the supremacy of Israel as this kingdom on earth that subdues everybody else. Right now, Israel is occupied by Rome, and of course they don't like it, and they've had these various uprisings. So they're anticipating this Messiah, or the Christ to come, is one that's going to lead them to victory, like so many times in their history of the cycle of the judges we see, where the conflict ensues, they cry out to God, a judge comes, and they win the battle and they're victorious, and they try to follow God for a while, and then they go into the same cycle. But when Jesus comes, something different takes place. And it's something that should have been recognized. We're continuing now in this survey of the life of Christ, and we talked about his being foretold, how God used Israel, formed Israel a nation to codify his righteous law with them, to be an example to all the nations around the world, and with the purpose of showing God's will, what he intended for man. Because remember, in the beginning, Adam and Eve were to go out and they were to be fruitful and multiply, and sin multiplied with them, so much so that God wanted to destroy everyone, and he ruined the creation with a flood, saved Noah and his family. And he starts with Noah and gives him the similar commission to go and be fruitful and multiply, and the same outcome is happening, and the same trajectory of man is happening. And so God intervenes by making a promise to Abraham. And within that promise, he tells Abraham that he's going to inherit this land, but not yet. It's going to take some 400 years, because the land of Canaan is they've got a ways to go for their sin to be full up. I think this was a misunderstanding right from the beginning. I don't think Israel ever really got God's intent, not as a nation. And which is why God always spoke in terms of a forever kingdom coming in the future. It wasn't the physical nation of Israel. It was going to be a forever kingdom with a forever high priest and Lord. Eventually was going to be revealed as Jesus the Christ. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 32, it's what we call Moses' farewell address, the end of Deuteronomy. And Moses, in speaking to the people in Deuteronomy 32, 46 and 47, he says, "Take to heart all the words which I am writing to you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, but your very life. And by this word you shall live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess." So that's Moses telling them how important God's word is. And remember, last week we talked about in the temptation, Jesus gives us the keys to this kingdom. He says, man doesn't live on bread alone, but every word that comes out of the mouth of God. We live on the very word of God. And back earlier in Deuteronomy in chapter 16, 18 through 20, Moses says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land the Lord your God is giving you." You know, when John's disciples confront Jesus, when John was in prison, it's recorded in Matthew 22, verse 16, they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances." We might say, Q pointed this out in our study this morning, those who seemed influential. I forgot the King James, you used the King James word. Yeah, I'm not a respecter of persons. Many times you'll see in the New Testament as well, God shows no partiality. It means God is just, and he's always, and thankfully so. When Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who seek after, thirst and hunger for this righteousness," you'll be satisfied. Because when you go back and you survey now, from the new covenant, looking back on the old covenant, how righteous God's word really is, how consistent God is in his judgment. We're noting in our classes, this is why I miss people in my classes when they don't show up. I can't pick on them here, but I get to look at Claudia always. I pick on her. So in Exodus, in our class in Exodus, one of the things that jumps out is the rules that God is imposing, is teaching them. They were going to be really in close quarters for a long period of time. They're wandering through the wilderness. God, he rescues them out of Egypt by his might and power. But he brings them on a path so that if they change their mind and want to go back, they can't go back. Because of the way they crossed the Red Sea and everything. And God says, I know you. You're going to want to go back, and I'm going to make it so you can't. So they're out there in the wilderness. They cannot survive without God's provision. But because they're camped now together, some 2 million people plus, it's hard for us to imagine a campground that big. And so they're all together, and they got to learn how to get along with each other. And so a lot of these rules, Rich brought some of them up this morning. The law was, it was do this and don't do that. It was boundaries. It was setting up parameters for them so that they could be good neighbors. That was the intent of it. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. And so Jordan, right? He pointed out when we were doing this study, Jordan said, well, boy, people could easily manipulate this, right? If an animal falls in a pit on your land, right? Here's how you restore that to your neighbor. But yeah, somebody devious, Jordan, right, could set a trap for his neighbor. I mean, you could abuse this neighborly law, but that's not what the intent of it was. And so we also noted that Moses got good advice from Jethro, his father-in-law, about setting up judges and how to settle disputes. And why were they enjoying such good judgment and abiding by those judgments? Because they knew Moses was God's man, and they feared God, and they respected Moses, and when he set up the judges, they fell in line with that. A judge wasn't going to take a bribe or show partiality because God would strike them down if they did. So we would say that hierarchy, that structure of authority was obeyed and was followed, and people enjoyed it. What happened over time? Why did that break down? As we notice very quickly in the scripture, in the Old Testament, that they started perverting things, that the priests were taking bribes, that they were skimming. We would say they had certain guidelines on how to operate the sacrifices and everything, and they had their rightful portion. But as soon as people lose trust in their leaders, that their leaders are judging righteously and justly, or that they can be bought, then the system breaks down. And even in Judges, toward the end, it got so bad where people decided they were going to do what's right in their own eyes. I mean, why would you get to a point where you would say that's a good way to operate a society where everyone does what's right in their own eyes? Because they don't trust the structure that's in place for them. I say that because I'm going to present this Sermon on the Mount where Jesus starts as kicking off a revolution in our thinking. Jesus said at the end of this sermon, I'll just make 3 points and we'll come back to this. He said in Matthew 7, it's at the end of the sermon's chapter, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Matthew 7, 7 and 8 says, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be open." These are promises of Jesus, who proved to be God in the flesh, saying, I have information, and I want you to understand it properly. And so the first promise is, if you seek it, you will find it. And as I said, I use that verse, chapter 5, verse 6, where he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Q likes to point this out in our morning study. The world is not very just in our perception, is it? Everybody does, and it creates division and contention, right? We look out there and we say, good grief, can this, how can we get along in this environment? Things can be so divisive. Jesus says if you seek, There are answers that you can find. He also says in John 8, verse 32, he says, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We got into a small discussion this morning about freedom. How Jesus frees us up from those burdens that Jesus would tell the rulers of the time. You put burdens that you don't even obey, and you don't lift a finger to help these people. But Jesus said, seek and you'll find, and you can know the truth, and this truth will set you free. And then, to sum this up in his promises, so you can seek him, you can know him, and then Matthew 11, 29 and 30 say, very famous verse, you know it real well. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The psalmist says in Psalm 107:9, for he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things. Now, that's the backdrop of, it said when Jesus comes and he teaches, and he actually shows us God in the flesh, what God intended, it stirs up a revolution. One that Matthew codifies here in his gospel by presenting this. When Jesus comes, unlike the law of Moses, where the law of Moses, we're just getting into this on our Wednesday class, right? Exodus 20, this, the 10 Commandments. We have our heading in there, the 10 Commandments. This is what you do. This is your relationship with God. You don't have any false gods before me. You honor me. You keep what I tell you. And then the second half is, here's how you be neighborly. You don't do this. You don't do this. You don't covet this. So it's got those rules. Well, Jesus starts out, as Matthew records this. Now think of this. Again, this is mind-blowing to me. I hate to use that term, but it's, consider who Matthew is, who's writing this gospel. A Levi. I don't know if it was Q who said this, or I was reading the bulletin, and it was saying, but it was in the bulletin. They like to wear what did it say? The Neiman Marcus robes. I thought that was funny. But the pretty clothes, right? I'm influenced by some of these dramatizations, Jackie, that we see on the apps. Jackie likes to watch these, and I think it might have been in The Chosen, but the way they portray Levi. Levi was one that was this tax collector, but they portray him as we might say he's obsessive compulsive. He's always, making himself proper. Even when he goes out, the streets are dusty and everything, but he's so concerned with getting a little dirt on his sandals or whatever. That's Levi. He's a tax collector. And he's out there. He knows how he's looked at when he's walking through the streets. They know who the tax collectors are, and they're disdained. Because the tax collectors they remind the people of the Roman occupation. And that's Levi, who Jesus calls, and he's the one that zeroes in on this, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and this is how he begins Jesus' ministry. And what does Jesus do? The crowds are gathered. At this point, Jesus, and you get this from the other Gospels, Mark in particular, wherever Jesus goes, he heals everybody. He's teaching with this wisdom that they're saying, where is he getting this from? And everybody's being healed, and the chit-chat's going everywhere. Everybody's coming out to see him. They're using terms like, hey, we found the Messiah. Well, by now, there's this huge crowd there, so Jesus goes up on the mountain, which is why it's called the Sermon on the Mount. and where he gets to a point where he can project, and people, great multitude, are gathering around, and they're taking up positions on the mountain and sitting down and listening to them. And it says, Matthew 5, verse 2, and this is, your heading might say, these are the Beatitudes. Why are they called the Beatitudes? This is what we should be, okay? We should strive to be these things. But imagine God coming in the flesh, and his presentation is not what you would expect. God coming in the flesh, the Lord of the hosts, the Lord of the armies. Okay, listen up, guys. Here's how we're going to take Rome out of here. No. He says, he opens his mouth and he taught them, saying, a series of blessings. Can you imagine that? How profound was this to Levi, a tax collector, Matthew, who's following Jesus now, and he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Wait a minute, what? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well, there's the kingdom word. But that's not a context that Israel was waiting to hear. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. Wait, it's blessed to be of poor spirit and mourn? They shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's not the world in our perception, the dog-eat-dog world that Hugh alludes to. He doesn't use those terms, but it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. The world teaches it's survival of the fittest, right? We say in the business world, right, you get hardened over time. And a lot of people, we have the old way was my handshake is my word, right? If I give you my word, I'm going to honor that. So people don't honor their commitments, and then people get hardened in business, Derek, and eventually they say, I'm going to get them before they get me, right? And then it's get all I can get, buyer beware, those kind of things. And Jesus says, the meek shall inherit the earth. And in the middle of these blessings, he says, our key verse here, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Can you imagine these Israelites that are basically being abused? They're occupied by Rome, but they're being abused by their own leaders. And Jesus is saying, blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness. You're going to be satisfied. Really? He goes on to say, blessed is the merciful. They shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. They shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. They shall be called the sons of God. Do you see how revolutionary this is? It's not God laying down commandments. He's saying, blessed are you if you do these things, if you seek after God. And what is God? What has God proved and demonstrated in his word? That he's righteous, that he's not a respecter of persons, that he's consistently good. And the psalmist, and the psalm that Alan read this morning, the Psalm 119 is the tribe after tribe giving homage to the testimony of God. We don't have life without this. But then he ends the blessings with this one. It's verse 10. And this is one, it's hard for us. This is really hard. And I'm curious, sorry my voice cracked. I'm curious to, when did Matthew put this down in writing? And I think a lot of times as the Spirit is recalling to them, I love watching the dramatizations. There's one on Matthew. It's a word for word, but it shows Matthew as, he's not writing it down. He's talking to the scribes, and the scribes are writing it down. And I imagine there's so many times in Paul's letters or in apostles' letters where they break into a prayer. And it almost like saying, wow, did I just say that? That's brilliant. And look, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But he just said, if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you'll be satisfied. Back in verse 6. And verse 10, he says, blessed are you who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on and says, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. It's no wonder that during Jesus' ministry, he speaks so often in terms of heaven and hell. And hell is something to be avoided at all costs. And this life is more valuable when we acknowledge God's salvation, because the life to come is eternal. But that's the opening. And like I said, I want you to think about this in terms of this satisfaction guarantee that Jesus gives us. God gives us this. But he does it in a revolutionary way. This is not what we would have expected listening to our religious leaders. This is so counter to that. Blessed are those. It's not blessed as the strong, or follow, the strong judge who goes into battle and wipes out thousands. After he says that, the next section is the salt and light. And now he gets personal. So blessed are you if you do all this stuff. And almost imagine this. And I love how Matthew captures this. Watch this. Verse 13. You. Are you listening? You are the salt of the earth. Wait a minute. The meek, the poor in spirit, the mourners, you are the salt of the earth. But watch this. If the salt loses its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Now listen, you are the light of the world. Over and over, Jesus would say, listen, if you have ears, listen. This is God in the flesh saying, listen up. I'm telling you the way it's going to be. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light in all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. It's revolutionary in the fact that it's not what Israel as a nation, I think, was expecting to hear. But these aren't generally, the crowds here are not the mockers. They're ones who are coming out to hear, what is this word made flesh? And here it is. He lays this out. And just to be clear, he says in verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So if you're thinking that Jesus is starting a rebellion, I said, yes, it's a revolution. It's a revolution in our thinking. But he's saying, I didn't come here to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the law. And he says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until it is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so, to do the same, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. It's so, like I said, it's so revolutionary. If we take a moment and consider this, and like I said, what a joy for those, if you're in the classes as we're discussing the Word together. Here's what God had in mind for us. We had this discussion, I think it was Wednesday night, Alice, right? It was, why do people follow such incredible claims? Or I forget the term you use, but why are they so... Can you imagine somebody turning on the TV at 3 o'clock in the morning and listening to somebody with their head on fire? We call it the TV evangelist. So compelling, so excited about this word. And you're at a low point in your life and I cannot go on this way. And you come to the realization that I am not the creator, I'm not the God, I'm not even Lord of my own life. I want a better way. And of course people are going to be loyal to the path that leads them out of the despair that they're in. God says, come to me. You will be satisfied. But it's through his word. There's a lot of roads. There's a lot of paths to this righteousness. But ultimately, God expects us to feed on this word and to grow up and mature in it. And that's when we truly can feel satisfied. There's nothing in this world that's going to fill the gap that coming to the truth and the knowledge of God can fill. You can find relief for a period of time, but ultimately, if we're truly going to be satisfied, and I would say again, no real joy is to learn from Jesus. And like I said, as I've been preparing for this, it just struck me how revolutionary this must have been for Peter, a Jew, to put this down in writing. To have God in the flesh present what he intended. And they couldn't have imagined this early on. We talked about it in our class. We're in Galatians now this morning, and this rift that was starting to form, this Jew and Gentile friction. But it's true with anybody. We all come from a belief system that is challenged by this word. And it's this word that, if we'll grow up by it, has the power. It's a living word, as we talked about last week, and it has the power to transform us and be renewed in our thinking, as Paul says in Romans 12, 1 and 2. Don't be conformed to this world any longer. Once you acknowledge that this is the way, now get into it any way that you can. Q uses the term, get in where you fit in, or fit in where you get in. I don't even know how he says it. Get in where you fit in. But find a way. Sometimes we lack motivation. We lose our zeal. Jesus says, you're the salt of the earth, but if you lose that saltiness, how can you be restored? We don't want to get to that point. Sometimes people say, well, it was easier in the first century. They were persecuted, so it drove them into that camaraderie and that fellowship, and they relied on the church more. Gee, I don't wish for persecution to draw us closer together. I would say, can't we do what God says and love one another and grow up now and shine the light of this truth before things get so bad? Look, the unrighteous will be judged. There's no question about it. But let's do our part. to mature and learn from the teaching of Jesus and begin that revolution in our mind and get renewed or revived. We sang the song this morning, Revive Us Again. We need revival. That's why we come here every first day of the week, is to be reminded and be renewed in our thinking that who we are and whose we are. The invitation song is always there. So as we sing this song, if there's something that you have on your heart that you want a special prayer for, or you just need to fulfill your commitment to God, that's the opportunity. Come up as we sing this song.